We will have our final presentation. It's not the least, probably the one we've all been looking forward to, from Dr. Joseph Kobisheshe, who is the Director for Environment, Safety, Health and Security at the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. And he's going to be talking about how can African countries utilize the available fossil fuel resources and at the same time be mindful of energy transitions and climate change.
Okay, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much, the teams at the Extractives Hub and the African Energy Minerals Management Initiative, and your partners for arranging this conference and for inviting me to participate as a panelist at this conference. And of course, to all our over 300 participants at the conference. The key question for Africa at the moment, as the previous speakers have echoed, is the fact that Africa has vast amount of fossil fuel resources, but at the same time, the benefits from these resources, if I may say, are threatened by the impacts of climate change, especially that arise as a result of the utilization, exploitation, development of these resources. So how, as African countries, the key question then is how, as African countries, do we balance the benefits from the utilization of these resources, but at the same time be mindful of the impacts of climate change? Just to share with you some statistics I was able to gather around about Africa resources, available resources. Africa has about 450 billion barrels, which is about 7% of the world's oil recoverable resources, and about 100 cubic meters of gas, which is about 13% of the world's gas resources. In terms of coal, we are not a big player. We have relatively small amounts, which are mainly concentrated in the southern part of the continent, mainly in South Africa and to a lesser extent in Mozambique. About half, 40 or so % of these resources are actually concentrated in the sub-Saharan Africa, the region where the East African region, where Uganda falls, is. In terms of the emissions, from the 2017 statistics, Africa contributed about 3.7% of the global emissions. The exact figure quoted is around 1.3 billion tons of CO2 out of the about nearly 36 or so billion tons that were emitted globally. So from an emissions perspective, we can see that Africa's emissions are comparatively lower when compared to other countries. Actually, when you compare all the total emissions from Africa are equivalent to the emissions from Japan alone, which are estimated at about 1.2 billion. You're looking at China at 9.8 billion, emitting almost more than 7 times than Africa as a continent. USA, 5.3 billion, which is more than 5 times the emissions from Africa. And Europe, I think, is around 3.5 billion. And again, that's about more than 3 times the emissions from Africa. So what are Africa's energy challenges? The key question for Africa is obviously lack of clean energy. The fossil fuels represent almost 40% of the overall mix in the sub-Saharan Africa, and which is more than 50% of the African energy mix. Biomass is the largest source of energy in Africa today, and it is mainly used for cooking, as it meets about 45% of the primary energy demand and over half of the final energy consumption. More than 2/3 of people in Africa live without access to electricity. More than 2/3 of the people who do not have access to electricity in the world actually live in sub-Saharan Africa. The lack of electricity pushes the use of inefficient, polluting, and expensive alternative solutions for essential services. And as most of you will be aware, this has accelerated environmental degradation, forests being cleared up for biomass to meet the energy needs, forest degradation. We have seen the forest per capita in the sub-Saharan Africa region declining at an average rate of about 3%. So how then does Africa, that holds about 10% of the world's oil and gas resources, have at the same time about 900 million Africans that have no access to clean cooking energy? That, of course, is explained by the population and poverty levels within Africa. We all know that Africa has the world's largest growing and youngest population, with over 1.3 billion people, which is equivalent to about 16.3% of the world's population. However, it is estimated that about 1 in 3 Africans, so that's about 400 million people, so representing 70% of the world's poor people, live below the global poverty line. So poverty in Africa pushes Africa at the front line of climate change, as the impacts of climate change affect more the poor and the vulnerable. So there is an imbalance here in terms of the emissions from Africa, but also now the impacts and how the magnitude of these impacts are felt from an African perspective. So how does this energy transition play when it comes into Africa's energy equation? The energy transitions bring mixed implications for African countries. The most recent transition has been driven largely by the problems of climate change and pollution, and this pressure has increased since the Paris Agreement of 2016. So emission reduction and improving efficiency is one of the main strategies that can be adopted by African countries in the development of their fossil fuel resources and to contribute to the transition, since fossil fuels are the leading contributor of CO2 emissions. The control and reduction of leakages during oil and gas operations, the prohibiting of flaring and venting, comprehensive monitoring of all emissions that arise out of a result of oil and gas activities could go a long way in helping the achievement of the emission reduction and improving efficiency. But in addition, Africa should obviously adopt green technologies like solar, thermal, and wind that reduce emissions and strengthen resilience. Without clean energy and other climate-friendly technologies, nations cannot make the transformational changes needed for climate resilient and low emission development, which is envisioned in the Paris Agreement. Investment into research and development to identify African solutions for African problems, I think, is also key in the development of Africa's fossil fuels. We also need to be mindful of responsible and sustainable development of these oil and gas resources. With the changing global dynamics, Africa should not assume that the resources will have the same level of future revenues. Future hydrocarbon revenues are under pressure, with some experts projecting that the oil revenues of 2010, 2014 may actually never be achieved again. And therefore, African countries should be responsible and sustainable in the development and managing of their oil and gas resources to ensure that the net revenues are realized. The need for transparent revenue management to foster economic growth and diversification cannot be overly emphasized. The development should really strike a balance between the economic environment and social factors. So, sustainable development, responsible and sustainable development of African oil and gas resources will be vital for Africa's economic outcomes and the global energy transitions. As I conclude, I think it is important that each African country should evaluate its current socio-economic and development needs, and based on where it wants to be in the medium and long term, it should define its targets and goals with the premise of ensuring its citizens have a decent livelihood, health, well-being, and access to clean and affordable energy. This, I think, is very key. The challenges in Africa at the moment revolve around the lack of a mix of energy resources in power generation, the low levels of access to modern energy, inadequate infrastructure, and of course, the low level of energy efficiency. There is therefore a need to adopt and utilize other modern fuels and technologies in order to achieve the objectives of emission reduction, protection of the environment, and energy conservation. But I think for the foreseeable future, the oil and gas resources in Africa will continue to make a significant contribution to tackling the continent's energy challenges, especially in terms of energy security, the savings in the foreign exchange. The PS earlier mentioned how many billions of dollars, for example, a small country with a smaller economy like Uganda spends on import of petroleum products. So for Africa, this will be a key. The sector will be key in getting savings from the foreign exchange. It will also be key in getting cleaner energy, considering that most of the households in Africa at the moment, over 45%, depend on unclean biomass fuel to meet their especially cooking needs. But there is a potential for LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, for substitution for the traditional biomass fuels, and of course the development of energy infrastructure. I hope I was able to make it within the allocated time, and then over to you, Joel, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kobusheche. We are really appreciative of these remarks, and it's a call to us all to be mindful of the climate change. And I hope the authorities and policymakers who are also in attendance here can take something from what you just presented to us.